The private study was the kind of environment wealth builds when it's trying to impress itself. Dark, wood-paneled walls, leather-bound books that probably hadn't been cracked open in a decade, and dead center on the main wall, a flush-mounted wall safe with a biometric panel glaring red in the dark, like an irritated eye. It was late. The only sounds were the heavy, expensive silence and the ragged breathing of a young woman whose high heels were striking the marble floor with the aggressive cadence of someone trying to use her own footsteps as an argument. The other woman was standing perfectly still in front of the safe, hands loosely clasped in front of her gray uniform apron. There wasn't an ounce of panic in her posture, just that hyper-specific absolute stillness of someone who learned a long time ago that playing dead is the only armor you get when you're the person with the least power in the room. The designer handbag slammed into the leather armchair with a sharp crack that the young woman definitely meant to sound like controlled rage, even though it just reeked of a total meltdown. "You incompetent old bat." Her voice spiked with zero warning, violently ripping from ice cold to a shrieking pitch in half a second. "The investors land in 20 minutes and you can't even open a damn door. This is exactly why people like you rot in the servants' quarters until you die." Her manicured hand clamped down hard around the older woman's wrist, with the messy, desperate pressure of raw fury. It wasn't a calculated move to restrain her. It was just the pathetic flailing of someone who needed to physically inflict their rage on a human target. The older woman didn't pull away. She didn't make a sound. She just closed her eyes for a split second, wearing the expression of someone quietly listening to a frequency nobody else in the room could tune into yet. In the shadowed doorway of the study, a man sitting in a high-end wheelchair slowly turned his head a fraction of an inch toward the screaming. He wore dark aviator sunglasses and had a white cane resting horizontally across his lap, his hands lightly folded over the grip, with the absolute dead calm of a man who learned how to weaponize his own immobility. Not a single muscle in his face twitched, but right at the corner of his mouth, for a microsecond faster than a heartbeat, something that looked dangerously like a smirk ghosted across his lips. The older woman gently detached her wrist from the vice grip, the smooth, deliberate motion of someone choosing to let go, not someone breaking free. Then she turned her eyes back to the steel face of the safe. She stared at it with a focus that wasn't visual, but tactile, the intense X-ray stare of a master mechanic reading a blueprint that the rest of the world doesn't even know exists. And she murmured, her voice dropping low with the lethal precision of a surgeon calling the time of death. "The actuator is misaligned. Third pin, port side." But to fully grasp what dragged these three people into this pressure cooker of a study tonight, we need to hit rewind. We need to go all the way back to where the real story actually starts, in the dead silence of the graveyard shift, hours before the mansion wakes up and demands to be served. Rosa had learned decades ago that the best hours of the day were the ones nobody else wanted to claim. At 5 a.m., when the sprawling estate was still drowned in that heavy, specific silence of massive houses that are asleep, a quiet packed with groaning hardwood, the low hum of industrial AC units, and the ghostly echo of people living parallel lives under the same roof without ever actually knowing each other, she was already grinding. There was a highly optimized flight path to her morning routine that wasn't written down in any corporate manual, and absolutely nobody had dictated it to her, because she had custom-built it over years of microscopic observation until it was the single most mathematically efficient way to lock down that specific environment. First, the East Wing corridor, right when the early morning light sliced through the massive arched windows, exposing the microscopic layer of dust the previous afternoon had left behind. Then the formal dining room, where the antique silver required a very specific aggressive polishing rhythm so it wouldn't tarnish. Finally, the massive two-story library, where she dusted the leather-bound first editions with a specialized micro-bristle brush she bought out of her own pocket because the cheap corporate dusters left micro-scratches on the antique spines. She glided through the massive rooms with the ghost-like fluidity of someone who completely owns a space without ever needing to announce she's in it. There wasn't a single wasted motion. Every swipe, every step was the pure, distilled result of an elite-level competence built over decades that nobody in that house had ever put on a performance review, but was undeniably baked into the DNA of every surface she touched. Back in her quarters, a cramped box at the dead end of the service wing boasting a single tiny window that stared at the back hedges, there was a completely different operating system running. It was a fiercely protected personal order, built with the scrap iron of a life that had sacrificed a hell of a lot, but ruthlessly hoarded the pieces that actually mattered. Her cot was made with the terrifying razor-sharp precision she applied to everything else. The sheets folded into 45-degree hospital corners that a Marine drill instructor would pass without a word. Sitting dead center on the cheap laminate nightstand was a framed photo of a young woman flashing a massive, brilliant smile, the kind of grin from someone who hasn't fully realized how heavy the world actually is yet. It was her daughter, holding a degree in systems engineering, living 3 states away but still calling every single Sunday night at 8 p.m. sharp, with a military punctuality she absolutely inherited from her mother. And shoved tightly on the narrow shelf, wedged right between the picture frame and the drywall, was a stack of heavy textbooks that absolutely nobody would ever expect to find in the bedroom of a 63-year-old housekeeper. High-level cryptographic architecture manuals, advanced electronic systems integration, enterprise-grade residential automation security protocols. Half of them were bristling with neon sticky notes, the margins completely blacked out with the tiny, hyper-dense, aggressive handwriting of an operator taking notes to survive, not to pass a test. She had walked through the service entrance of this estate 12 years ago, handing over a painfully thin resume that listed domestic management experience and absolutely zero else. What the sterilized piece of paper deliberately left out, because HR algorithms don't have a drop-down menu for this specific kind of collateral damage, was that she had spent the 15 years prior grinding as a senior security systems architect before the tech firm aggressively liquidated its assets, leaving her, at 50 years old, to discover the brutal reality that Silicon Valley's appetite for middle-aged female hardware engineers was basically zero. She took the housekeeper gig purely out of raw survival instinct, but she stayed for reasons that were a hell of a lot more complicated than a paycheck, because Victor Andrade, the billionaire whose name was on the deed, had started out as the incredibly rare breed of boss who actually treated the invisible people like human beings, which was practically a superpower in that tax bracket. Victor Andrade was 58, a self-made titan who built his empire using the exact kind of lethal intelligence that operates best in the shadows. Not the loud, flashy TED Talk charisma of tech bros, but the dead quiet, predatory focus of a guy who reads the entire chessboard in 3 seconds, and only strikes when the kill is guaranteed. For the last 12 months, he had been navigating his own mansion exclusively in a high-end custom wheelchair, wearing pitch-black aviators, sweeping a white cane across the Italian marble. The official PR release blamed a catastrophic rollover car wreck that had supposedly caused irreversible bilateral optic nerve damage. But to peel back the layers on what was actually going down, you have to rewind to a random Tuesday afternoon 6 months ago, when Victor rolled out of his private elevator earlier than his schedule dictated and caught the tail end of Isabella's voice echoing down the west corridor. She was deep into a phone call she clearly, arrogantly believed was totally off the grid. She was laughing. It was that highly specific, ugly laugh of reckless, unfiltered intimacy. Not the breathy, melodic, perfectly calibrated giggle she weaponized at charity galas, but a sharp, grating, triumphant cackle that bled pure intent. He killed the motors on his chair, sat dead still in the shadows, and absorbed fragments of a conversation that didn't need a damn decoder ring to translate. She was bragging about his deteriorating state. She was calculating out loud exactly how easy the hostile takeover was going to be. She was venting about how much more excruciating investment time she had to put in, whining about the sheer, exhausting patience a portfolio of that magnitude demanded from a woman executing her specific endgame. Victor sat in that freezing hallway for a long, heavy hour after the call ended. Then he picked up his encrypted burner and called his bulldog attorney. He didn't pull the trigger on the separation papers. He ordered something infinitely more surgical. He stated, with the absolute sub-zero clarity of a man who has already walked through the fire of betrayal and come out the other side made of ice, that he needed to definitively map out exactly who was still standing in his corner when the money and the power were completely stripped away. He told the lawyer he needed breathing room to run a massive counter-surveillance op. And most importantly, he needed to engineer a high-pressure scenario that made it physically impossible for the rats to hide behind polite lies. The horrific car crash had been completely real, the twisted metal, the ICU stay, the brutal rehab. But the catastrophic damage to his vision was, according to the elite private specialists who were legally bound by ironclad NDAs, entirely reversible with aggressive therapy and time. The cold-blooded decision to let the world believe he was permanently in the dark was the strategic masterstroke of a man who knew that the only time people show you their true face is when they are dead certain you can't see them. Isabella had been showing her true face with a terrifying absolute consistency that left zero margin for error. She had targeted him at an elite philanthropic gala 2 years prior, armed with a flawless smile and the hyper-calculated conversational judo of someone who majored in manipulating billionaires. She had executed the long-con infiltration with a sociopathic patience that he had genuinely, mistakenly bought as real affection, right up until that phone call in the hallway. Now, inside his house, she operated with the arrogant swagger of a hostile occupying force, firing contractors without asking, casually auditing the estate's ledgers with a predatory familiarity that he was now tracking with lethal focus, and relentlessly treating Rosa with the hyper-specific sadistic cruelty of an insecure narcissist who desperately needs to torture someone defenseless just to prove to herself that she holds the whip. It was during a catered patio lunch with her inner circle of socialite vampires that Isabella's cruelty slipped the leash entirely, exposing a lot more than she probably intended. She had aggressively snapped her fingers for Rosa to clear the plates, using the exact same tone you'd use to call a stray dog. The table of women giggled with that toxic, reflexive laughter you only hear when the apex predator makes a joke. Not because the joke was actually funny, but because laughing on cue is the mandatory tax for drinking the host's expensive champagne. Isabella launched into a vicious, unprompted teardown of Rosa's age, mocking the stiffness in her joints, sneering at the heavy, exhausted look she wore like a second skin, as if grinding out manual labor for 12 hours a day was some sort of personal insult to the aesthetic of the mansion. She delivered every insult with a light, breezy, sociopathic detachment, dissecting the older woman like a lab rat, completely stripping away her humanity. When Rosa's hand slipped and she dropped a silver soup spoon onto the stone patio, a microscopic, totally meaningless mistake that happens in literally every kitchen on Earth, Isabella slowly raised her eyes to her friends, flashing the terrifying, triumphant grin of a sniper who just got the green light. Don't mind her. Advanced dementia is totally par for the course at her stage of decline. The laughter that erupted was the absolute worst kind. It wasn't even a calculated attack. It was just the empty, reflexive cackling of hollow people who didn't even bother to process the sheer evil of what they were laughing at. Rosa slowly bent down, picked the silver spoon off the stone, her eyes locked firmly on the ground, her jaw clamped so tight the muscle jumped. It was the brutal pressure of a woman aggressively swallowing down a nuclear explosion of rage that she absolutely could not afford to let out. Victor, sitting dead silent at the head of the table, had micro-adjusted his head toward the impact. He couldn't process the visual micro-expressions through the dark lenses, but his ears caught every single razor-sharp syllable, and the terrifying, rigid tension locking up his jaw was the only visible tell that every piece of intel was being aggressively logged and filed for the execution. Then, with calculated precision, he knocked his crystal water goblet right off the table. He perfectly sold the physical mechanics of the accident, the clumsy, sweeping arm movement of a blind man, totally misjudging his spatial awareness, the fingers totally missing the target. The heavy crystal hit the patio and shattered, the ice water bleeding rapidly across the pristine white linen tablecloth, with the aggressive speed of a total disaster. Isabella instantly snapped her jaw open. Leave it. The help will mop it up. But Victor cut through the chaos, his voice dropping into that dead calm, low-frequency register of a man who never has to shout to dominate a room, stating simply that Rosa could take care of the glass, if she wanted to. There was something buried deep in the specific cadence of how he delivered that line. It wasn't a barked order. It was a quiet authorization. And in that brutal environment, the difference was everything. It made Rosa freeze for a fraction of a second before she quietly stepped in with the towel. As she knelt down in the puddle to sweep up the jagged crystal shards, Victor leaned heavily over the armrest of his chair and murmured, his voice pitched way too low for the laughing vampires at the table to pick up, but perfectly calibrated for her ears alone. 2 words. Thank you. Rosa's head snapped up. There was a highly probable chance he literally couldn't see the shock registering on her face, and yet he had said it anyway. He had actually thanked her, not for wiping up some spilled water, but for the massive, unspoken weight behind the action. For the sheer, stubborn grit of a human being continuing to execute her job with ironclad dignity, in a toxic war zone that absolutely didn't deserve her. She offered him a tiny, exhausted, incredibly sad smile, the specific guarded expression that only slips out when someone realizes they've been truly, deeply seen by the absolute last person they expected. And right there, in the wreckage of the shattered crystal, a massive, invisible fault line shifted between them. Nothing was spoken, nothing was formalized, no contracts were signed. It was the kind of absolute blood oath alliance that doesn't require a single word, because it's forged in something infinitely harder than language. That night, locked in her tiny quarters, staring out at the pitch-black hedges, Rosa sat on the edge of her perfectly made cot for 2 solid hours, gripping the photo of her daughter. Her brain started chewing on radioactive thoughts she normally aggressively suppressed during the day, when the sheer volume of physical labor kept the demons at bay. She thought about the suffocating reality of being an absolute genius-level systems architect, only to be treated like a brain-dead mop by a sociopath in designer shoes. She thought about the psychological torture of ghosting through a compound for 12 years, completely invisible. She thought about the billionaire in the wheelchair who had quietly dropped a thank you to a ghost that Isabella didn't even consider human enough to address by her actual name. And she thought with a sudden cold clarity that stories like this rarely end where the villain thinks they're ending. The weeks leading up to the blowout in the study carried the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of a massive steel trap being slowly, methodically ratcheted open. Not the panicked rushing of a guy afraid he's going to miss his shot, but the terrifying, patient deliberation of a sniper who knows the exact wind speed and is just waiting for the target to step into the crosshairs. Victor spent that entire month aggressively hoarding intel, using the exact same ruthless methodology he used to execute corporate takeovers. He knew, via encrypted reports from his bulldog lawyer and a deeply buried shadow network of biometric logs Isabella had no idea existed, that she had tried to physically breach the private study at least 4 times in the last 3 weeks. He had hard data proving she had secretly retained a notoriously aggressive wealth management consultant who had absolutely zero legitimate reason to be sniffing around Victor's accounts, unless his fiancée was actively gearing up for a massive, hostile liquidation of his assets. And the crown jewel of the intel, the flush-mounted wall safe in the study, the absolute vault that held the newly inked, highly sensitive terms of his last will and testament, plus the master framework for the billion-dollar international merger dropping tomorrow, had triggered 2 silent alarms after someone tried to bypass the scanner using Isabella's thumbprint, a biometric signature Victor had explicitly, permanently locked out of the system. She hit a brick wall. The system instantly hard-locked after the second failed attempt, throwing the vault into a deep freeze protocol that demanded the manual analog override, a heavy, brutalist mechanical failsafe totally severed from the digital mainframe, engineered specifically for catastrophic EMP scenarios or total system hijackings. It was a massive, old-world vault door installed during the gut renovation 12 years ago, and there was exactly one living, breathing human being inside that compound who possessed the hyper-specific, tactile mechanical genius required to crack it open. Victor just sat back and waited for Isabella to walk into the minefield. She kicked the tripwire right on schedule. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, she waltzed into the study where he was sitting in the dark, pretending to struggle with an audiobook. She casually brought up the vault, using the overly rehearsed, painfully fake tone of someone trying to sound spontaneously helpful, casually dropping that it might be super convenient to have the merger dossiers physically on hand before the heavy hitters arrive tomorrow, suggesting they should probably handle that annoying little glitch with the lock before it became a humiliating roadblock in front of the board. Victor listened to the entire performance with the terrifying, invisible focus he had honed over 6 months of playing blind. Then he casually mentioned, his voice carrying the total deadpan calm of a guy just discussing the weather, that Rosa was the sole custodian of the analog override protocols, that it had been hardwired that way since the installation, that he implicitly, absolutely trusted Rosa to handle the breach before the suits landed. He let the dead silence after that sentence hang in the room for exactly the amount of time it takes a bullet to hit center mass. He couldn't see Isabella's face, but he had gutted enough corporate sharks in boardrooms to know exactly what the sheer, unadulterated panic looked like ripping across her features in that split second. Down in the industrial kitchen an hour later, Rosa was aggressively prepping vegetables, leaning into the loud rhythmic chopping as a mental reset, when Isabella blew through the swinging doors like a hurricane. No warning, no knock, just that arrogant, hyper-aggressive invasion of space that screamed she already considered the entire estate her personal property. Even if the ink on the marriage license wasn't dry yet, she planted herself dead center in the kitchen, glaring at Rosa with the specific toxic sneer she reserved for people she considered less than human. The boss is blind." She dropped the sentence with the brutal neutrality of a weather report. "That's exactly why he's been totally brainwashed by your pathetic fake loyalty routine. But I see exactly what you are." A short, lethal pause, perfectly timed for maximum damage. "You are going to crack that safe the second I snap my fingers, and you're going to do it fast. Or I will personally guarantee you are thrown out on the street tonight, and I will make sure you never scrub another toilet in this zip code again." Rosa didn't break her chopping rhythm for a full second. Then she slowly, deliberately laid the heavy chef's knife down on the cutting board with the absolute stillness of a woman choosing to pause, not a woman who had been ambushed. She slowly turned her head to face Isabella, wearing the exact same dead-eyed expression she had forged over 63 years of surviving environments infinitely more dangerous than this kitchen. "The vault is a highly sensitive machine, ma'am." Her voice was dead calm, completely stripped of any aggressive challenge, but entirely devoid of the panicked submission Isabella was hunting for. "It requires absolute respect to operate." Isabella just stood there, her eyes narrowing into slits, her brain frantically trying to recalibrate the power dynamic that had just completely failed to assert itself. Then she spun on her heel and stormed out of the kitchen with the exact same violent lack of ceremony she used to break in. Rosa stood frozen at the cutting board for a long minute, before picking the knife back up. There was a heavy, metallic taste to that entire micro-interaction that she couldn't quite translate into words yet. But her gut was screaming at her with absolute clarity. She was being actively deployed as a pawn in a massive high-stakes war game she didn't know the rules to, and the tectonic plates shifting under her feet were infinitely more dangerous than Isabella's cheap tantrums, and far more complex than Victor's quiet gratitude. The night before the heavy hitters landed carried that specific, suffocating atmospheric pressure that always blankets a war room before a massive strike. It wasn't just the anxiety of the meeting itself. It was the crushing weight of everything that was about to be detonated beneath the polite corporate surface. Isabella had waited until the estate was completely dead. She waited until the long corridors were pitch black and the executive wing was totally abandoned before she ambushed Rosa, moving with a toxic cocktail of desperate urgency and barely contained violence that had officially become her default setting. She cornered the housekeeper near the study doors and physically shoved her inside, her hand gripping Rosa's bicep with a pressure that was absolutely not a suggestion. The private study was a black hole, illuminated only by the angry, pulsing amber light of the biometric scanner and a weak, ghostly moonlight bleeding through the high-arched windows. Isabella slammed the heavy oak doors shut and immediately crossed her arms, striking the classic, aggressive posture of a hostage negotiator, laying down the terms before the gunfight starts. She ordered Rosa to crack the vault. Right now. Do it. Rosa slowly stepped up to the steel faceplate with her trademark, infuriating calm. She started explaining, her voice dropping into a low, highly technical register, that the analog override was a deeply sensitive, tactile operation, that she literally had to feel the micro-tumblers click through the steel, a process that absolutely could not be rushed without risking a catastrophic, permanent hard lock of the entire system. She stated she needed total silence. She needed time. Isabella didn't give a damn about silence or time. What violently erupted out of her mouth over the next 3 minutes was the concentrated radioactive venom of weeks of agonizing waiting, fueled by the sheer narcissistic rage of a woman who just realized a literal peasant held the keys to her billion-dollar kingdom. She thought this was going to be a walk in the park. She assumed threatening a minimum wage paycheck would shatter the old woman instantly. That sheer intimidation and social dominance would force compliance in 10 seconds flat. But Rosa's dead quiet resistance, not screaming, not throwing a punch, just being an absolute immovable brick wall, had slowly mutated day by day into the exact kind of psychological torture that drives narcissists completely insane, precisely because there was absolutely nothing for her to attack. She violently shoved Rosa toward the steel door, both hands slamming hard into the older woman's shoulders. "Then feel the damn pins. Old hands for an old safe." Rosa caught her balance instantly, her center of gravity dropping low, feet planting hard into the marble, her spine automatically absorbing the shockwave with the ironclad muscle memory of decades on her feet. She slowly raised her right hand toward the massive mechanical dial, her fingertips hovering over the cold steel with the terrifying precision of a sniper dialing in the windage. And that's when Isabella's hand cracked across her face. The slap detonated in the pitch-black room with a sickening crack that the dead silence aggressively amplified. It wasn't some cold, calculated mafia move. It was the total catastrophic loss of control from a woman who had kept the mask glued on for way too long. It was the exact second the slick, strategic corporate shark died, leaving behind nothing but a pathetic, violently thrashing bully. Rosa stumbled back half a step. She stood dead still, her hand slowly rising to press flat against her chest, not grabbing her stinging cheek in pain, but the deep instinctual reflex of guarding her core after being violated by someone who had absolutely zero right to touch her. She didn't drop a single tear. Her eyes didn't drop to the floor in shame. They locked dead onto Isabella, and the look burning in those eyes wasn't fear. It wasn't even screaming rage, which honestly would have been a hell of a lot easier for Isabella to handle. It was something Isabella clearly never, ever expected to see looking back at her. A deep, suffocating ocean floor level of pity. It was the devastating look of someone staring at a rabid dog, recognizing the pathetic sadness of confirming that the monster was exactly as ugly as everyone feared. On the other side of the mahogany wall, locked in an adjacent panic room that had been Black Ops rigged with a direct feed to the estate's hidden camera network, Victor Andrade was gripping the armrests of his wheelchair so hard his knuckles were bone white. He had watched the entire assault go down in dead silence, staring at the monitors with the icy focus of a prosecutor logging Exhibit A, his entire body vibrating with the violent effort of not kicking the door off the hinges and ending her right then. He forced his body to stay in that chair, with the agonizing discipline of a man who knows pulling the trigger early ruins the entire operation, and that stepping in now would incinerate months of excruciating patience. But the white-knuckled death grip on the chair screamed exactly what his frozen face was hiding. Rosa delivered the final blow, her back to the safe, staring straight through Isabella, her voice forged from a lifetime of maintaining ironclad dignity in trenches that would have broken most people in a week. "You have a rotten heart, girl." It wasn't a dramatic curse. It was a coroner's report, delivered with the absolute dead calm certainty of a woman who had seen enough evidence to close the case. And cruelty like that always leaves a permanent scar. She turned on her heel and walked out of the study. Her chin was locked at the exact same elevation it had been when she walked in. Her stride wasn't a panicked retreat, but a highly disciplined tactical withdrawal, her spine radiating a posture that 12 years of corporate humiliation hadn't managed to bend an inch. Isabella was left completely alone in the pitch-black room, staring at the angry red flashing light on the wall, the sickening echo of her own slap still ringing in her ears. It is genuinely sickening to believe that someone could physically assault an older woman out of pure sociopathic arrogance, isn't it? That they could weaponize their fake power to inflict actual pain, and then just go to sleep that night like nothing happened? If your blood is boiling right now, if you are 100% riding with Rosa, smash that like button. The tap is your way of saying you saw it, that she isn't invisible, that someone on the other side of this screen actually gives a damn about the absolute garbage that went down in that dark room. Because the scar Rosa mentioned wasn't some poetic metaphor. It was the brutal, inescapable blowback that detonates when someone builds their entire empire on the psychotic delusion that they can treat human beings like trash without catching a bullet in return. And when that karma finally hits, it's not because some higher power decided to punish them. It's just the raw physics of reality finally smashing into their delusions at 100 miles an hour. And reality, in that mansion, was inbound with the terrifying punctuality of 4 billionaires whose private jets were touching down in less than 20 minutes. The morning of the merger summit broke with the heavy, suffocating inevitability of a massive storm front, finally colliding with a powder keg. Rosa had rolled out of bed before her alarm, just like she had for over 4,000 days, and ran her exact same tactical sweep of the estate with the identical, robotic rhythm. Not because she was blind to the bloodbath coming, but because sticking to the operational protocol was the only armor she had to keep from completely shattering before the shooting started. She aggressively buffed the massive silver tray in the foyer until it looked like a mirror. She executed a flawless arrangement of the imported orchids in the main hall. She brewed the single origin espresso exactly the way the sharks from New York expected it, not because Isabella barked the order, but because she was a professional, and the flawless execution of her craft had absolutely nothing to do with the garbage human beings she was serving. The heavy hitters rolled through the iron gates at exactly 10:01 a.m. in 2 armored black SUVs, stopping dead center on the circular driveway. It was 4 guys, running different ages and different coast accents, but all carrying that identical, terrifying posture that only comes with generational wealth. Not the loud, flashy flexing of tech money rookies, but the dead calm, lethal stillness of apex predators who don't need to bark because everyone already knows they own the junkyard. They greeted Isabella with the icy transactional courtesy you use when you haven't fully decided if the person in front of you is an asset or a liability yet. Victor had been pinged on the encrypted internal comms the second the tires hit the driveway. He was locked in the master suite, or so Isabella smoothly lied to the suits, resting his eyes before making an appearance. The tragic visual impairment made morning so dreadfully exhausting, you see. She delivered the lie with the sickening, Oscar-worthy performance of a deeply devoted caregiver, and the billionaires nodded along with the polite, dead-eyed blankness of men who don't care enough to question the narrative. The War Council kicked off in the Grand Salon. Heavy dossiers slapped down on the mahogany table, while Rosa ghosted through the room pouring espresso, moving with the total, learned invisibility of a phantom. She caught the micro-expressions, the quick, hyper-calculated side eyes the investors were shooting each other every time Isabella opened her mouth. Their body language was screaming with the aggressive restraint of men who had flown 3,000 miles with a lot of heavy questions that Isabella was currently failing to answer. It was during a tense lull in the financial readouts that Isabella pivoted hard to Rosa. She wrapped the demand in the slick corporate language of a live demo, claiming there was a critical addendum locked in the vault they desperately needed to review. And what a perfect, synergistic opportunity to showcase the estate's state-of-the-art, military-grade security protocols, highlighting the flawless operational management of the property. It was the kind of corporate garbage speak that sounds totally reasonable until you shine a flashlight on it, and the billionaires didn't have the intel to know they were being played. Rosa took the hit without blinking. She replied, her voice dropping into a low, dead calm technical register, that the mechanical override was highly volatile and demanded a sterile environment to crack, that she needed absolute zero noise, total focus, and that it was absolutely not a parlor trick you perform for an audience of suits sipping coffee. Isabella's mask slipped for a microsecond, pure venom flashing in her eyes before she violently wrenched the smile back into place. Then she took the gloves off. She didn't start screaming. She deployed that toxic, hyper-condescending customer service voice that is infinitely more insulting than a screaming match because it treats the target like a brain-damaged child. She turned to the billionaires with a fake, apologetic smile, playing the exhausted victim forced to deal with incompetent help, casually tossing out the lie that the elderly staff sometimes suffer from these tragic, irrational paranoia episodes when their daily routine is disrupted. Then she locked eyes with Rosa and called her an obstinate, confused old woman with the casual cruelty of someone swatting a fly. The temperature in the room instantly dropped 20 degrees. The investors froze. Rosa stated flatly that she needed to get authorization from Mr. Victor before laying a finger on the vault. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a hard stop, delivered with the absolute clarity of a woman dropping an anvil on the conversation. She took one deliberate step toward the salon doors, fully intending to march upstairs and pull the pin on the grenade. Isabella beat her to the exit. It wasn't a full-blown tackle. It was a highly aggressive physical block, throwing her body weight between Rosa and the heavy double doors, weaponizing her physical space to establish total dominance. She slammed her back against the wood, arms spread slightly, and dropped her voice into a vicious, ragged whisper that the suits across the massive room couldn't hear the words to, but definitely caught the lethal frequency of. She hissed about expensive jewelry suddenly vanishing. She spit out venom about Rosa having unmonitored access to the compound for 12 years. She laid out exactly how fast a single phone call to the local police chief would completely incinerate the legacy of a devoted housekeeper, instantly mutating the story into the pathetic tale of a greedy servant who exploited a blind billionaire, quietly stealing from him for a decade until the new lady of the house finally caught her red-handed. It was a total fabrication. Pure garbage. But threats built on absolute lies are usually the most lethal, because the legal and financial bloodbath required to prove you're innocent will bankrupt you faster than just taking the hit. The billionaires were practically squirming in their tailored suits. Two of them aggressively broke eye contact, suddenly intensely fascinated by the spreadsheets in front of them, pulling the classic coward's move of pretending they were deaf, so they wouldn't have to get involved in the crossfire. Nobody said a damn word. Rosa stared at the human barricade. She looked at the four cowards hiding behind their coffee cups. She locked eyes with Isabella, running a massive total threat assessment that took exactly 1 second to process. And then she turned her back on the door and walked straight toward the safe. She closed the distance slowly, every single footstep hitting the marble with the heavy, terrifying calculation of a sniper controlling their breathing. When she hit the steel faceplate, she froze, her hands hovering an inch off the freezing metal. The silence in the room fundamentally changed. It wasn't the awkward tension from before. It was the suffocating, heavy pause of a master operator pulling decades of suppressed, lethal genius out of the dark, gearing up to deploy a skill set that nobody in that room even knew existed. She pressed her right palm flat against the cold steel. She slowly tilted her head, pressing her ear against the vault door like a safecracker from a 1950s heist movie. But there was absolutely nothing theatrical about it. It was the hyper-focused, surgical posture of a predator who knows exactly what frequency she's hunting for and exactly where it hides. The entire study went dead quiet, not the toxic forced silence from when Isabella was throwing her tantrum. This was the heavy, involuntary silence that paralyzes a room when apex predators realize they are suddenly in the presence of something they don't understand, but their primal instincts recognize as totally lethal. It was the silence of absolute, involuntary respect. Rosa started tapping the steel faceplate with her fingernail. Slow, incredibly methodical strikes, tracking left to right, millimeter by millimeter, running a sonar ping across the internal mechanics. Her eyes were squeezed shut. Her face was locked in that terrifying, dead calm trance of absolute hyperfocus, where the entire universe shrinks down to the sound of metal clicking. Isabella watched her for 30 agonizing seconds, arms crossed defensively, before loudly announcing to the room that they were literally watching a geriatric mental breakdown in real time, and that Victor was going to be furious when he found out his deranged maid had finally snapped. One of the billionaires shot her a look that screamed he was 2 seconds away from pulling his funding. And then Rosa's eyes snapped open. They didn't flutter open like someone waking up from a nap. They snapped open with the violent, terrifying clarity of a radar system successfully locking onto a target. The eyes of a woman who just heard exactly what she needed to hear to blow the doors off the place. She straightened her spine, her entire posture instantly mutating from submissive housekeeper to apex operator. Her hands, which had been gently hovering over the metal, suddenly moved with a blinding, aggressive confidence that had absolutely nothing to do with what she'd shown them for 12 years. It wasn't flashy showmanship. It was the terrifying, raw efficiency of an engineer executing a kill code she wrote herself. Isabella opened her mouth to scream an order, but the sound that ripped through the room wasn't her voice. It was a massive mechanical crack, clean, lethal, the heavy, deeply satisfying sound of a multi-ton locking mechanism violently snapping back into alignment, the rogue third pin slamming home into the cylinder, triggering a cascade of heavy tumblers dropping like dominoes, culminating in the massive primary locking bar disengaging with the heavy oiled resistance that engineers design, so a vault never accidentally pops open. The vault door swung wide, the study flatlined. Rosa took one calculated step backward, arms dropping loosely to her sides, locking eyes with the billionaires. Her face was a total blank slate. She wasn't begging for applause. She wasn't looking for a pat on the back. It was the stone-cold stare of an operator who just neutralized the target and is waiting for the next order. Isabella was staring at the gaping black hole in the wall, her face completely stripped of the arrogant corporate mask. She looked like a terrible actor whose teleprompter just died in the middle of a live broadcast, totally paralyzed, with absolutely no idea how to ad-lib the next scene. The silence that hijacked the room after the steel door swung open was a totally different beast than the quiet from before. The previous silence was built on fear, cowards biting their tongues because they were terrified of the crossfire. This was something else. This was the deafening silence of a room full of sharks trying to process a massive, violent paradigm shift that just came from a blind spot they didn't even know existed. Rosa stood next to the open vault for a long, heavy beat. Then she slowly pivoted to face the billionaires. When she spoke, her voice had completely dropped the submissive, polite housekeeper routine. It was gone. What replaced it was a cold, razor-sharp authority, the natural, undeniable command of a woman who isn't asking for a seat at the table, but is casually taking ownership of the entire room through sheer, undeniable brilliance. The failure is not in the code. She delivered the verdict with the icy precision of a forensic analyst reading a death certificate, a diagnosis she had known for a decade, but was finally speaking out loud. It is a catastrophic hardware failure. The third pin actuator is misaligned by exactly 0.3 millimeters. It is a fatal manufacturing defect, hard-coded into the original production run of this specific chassis. She turned slightly, pointing a single finger down at the bottom corner of the steel frame, aiming right at a microscopic serial number stamped into the metal. The kind of invisible data point that only exists for the engineers, completely invisible to the suits writing the checks. I filed the critical bug report on this exact defect with the manufacturer 11 years ago. They ignored it. One of the billionaires physically jerked forward in his leather chair. Another slowly dropped his expensive Montblanc pen onto the mahogany. Isabella was frozen solid. But it wasn't her aggressive, power-posing stiffness from earlier. It was the terrifying paralysis of a woman who realizes the bridge just collapsed behind her, and she is standing on thin air. Rosa walked past them, heading straight for the massive library wall with the dead reckoning of someone who knows the exact coordinates by heart. She ran her fingers across the antique spines for half a second, not searching, just confirming the target, and yanked out a faded blue technical manual that had been sitting in that exact slot since the day she started. She flipped open the back cover and pulled out a microscopic, ultra-thin magnetic flathead screwdriver. She had stashed it in that book 12 years ago for the exact same reason a spy tapes a burner phone under a sink. You never know when you're going to need to go to war. She marched back to the vault. What went down over the next 120 seconds wasn't some lucky improvisation. It was an absolute masterclass in mechanical dominance. Her hands moved in a blur, driven by the violent muscle memory of a woman who had executed this exact surgical strike hundreds of times in environments infinitely more stressful than a quiet study full of terrified suits. She popped the internal steel panel off with 4 rapid, aggressive strikes, exposing the guts of the machine. She didn't even use the flashlight to find the actuator set screw. She knew exactly where it was buried, because she had personally designed the architectural schematics that dictated where it lived. The magnetic screwdriver locked into the microscopic slot with a satisfying snap. 1/4 turn right. Dead stop. The vault let out a tiny metallic ping, completely different from the heavy clunk of the lock. It was the high-frequency sound of a severed spine snapping back into alignment, the sound of a dead machine finally remembering what it was built to do. Rosa stood up, stepped to the biometric keypad, and her fingers absolutely obliterated the numbers. It wasn't the hesitant pecking speed of a user trying to remember a password. It was a blinding, aggressive sequence of keystrokes, a hyper-classified, deep-level developer backdoor code that wasn't printed in any manual on Earth, because it only existed in the brain of the engineer who wrote the original firmware. The massive steel door popped entirely off its secondary latches, swinging wide open with the silent, terrifying smoothness of a multi-million-dollar machine working perfectly. The brutal, effortless execution of someone who had just cracked a military-grade vault with the casual ease of opening a kitchen drawer. One of the billionaires let out a choked gasp that sounded like he'd been punched in the throat. Another had physically launched himself out of his chair without even realizing he was standing. The third shark was staring at Rosa with his jaw basically resting on the table, frantically rewriting his entire worldview in real time. Isabella was ghost white, not the pale shock of someone who got jump-scared. This was the slow, sickening drain of color that happens when catastrophic reality hits you in waves, each wave drowning you deeper than the last. Her lips had flattened into a bloodless line. The arrogant fury was totally gone, replaced by the suffocating, silent terror of a woman waiting for the guillotine to drop. Rosa slowly turned to face her, armed with the terrifying patience of someone who holds all the cards. "My name is Rosa Alencar." She dropped her real name into the dead silence with the effortless power of a queen reclaiming her throne, shattering the pathetic housekeeper label, nuking the MAID insult, totally incinerating the nameless void Isabella had tried to force her into. "I wrote the original kernel firmware for this vault chassis for Halcyon Security Solutions back in 2012. No screaming, no dramatic mic drop. Just the cold, radioactive truth delivered with the dead-eyed certainty of a sniper calling a hit. I took early retirement to become a full-time caregiver for my daughter, who was diagnosed with a terminal illness." A brief, suffocating pause. Not a theatrical pause to milk the drama, but the raw, involuntary hesitation of a mother touching a scar that still bleeds. "After she passed, I took this job because I desperately needed the silence. Not because I needed your money." The billionaires weren't even breathing. She slowly turned her head toward the massive oak doors, Victor Andrade had ghosted into the study. The electric motors on his wheelchair were totally silent, and nobody had heard him roll down the hallway. He was sitting dead center in the doorway, holding his pitch-black aviators in his right hand. Not wearing them, holding them. And his entire posture radiated the terrifying, lethal energy of a predator who has finally stopped playing with his food. Rosa locked eyes with him. "I deduced your optical nerve was fully functional 3 weeks ago, sir." Her voice was the exact same icy register. No accusations, no fake gasps of surprise, just the clinical delivery of hard facts. "I kept my mouth shut because I respected the operational parameters of the stress test you were running." She paused for exactly 1 second. It was a highly necessary operation. Victor sat frozen in the doorway. With the dark lenses gone, the expression burned into his face was the most terrifyingly honest thing anyone in that room had seen in years. It was the look of a man who threw a hand grenade expecting to blow up a rat and ended up uncovering a diamond mine. One of the billionaires slowly swiveled his head toward Isabella, his eyes narrowing with the cold calculation of a man connecting some very ugly dots. Isabella had physically backed up against the mahogany wall without even realizing her feet were moving. The $5,000 dress, the flawless blowout, the diamond earrings, the entire elite armor she had spent years building was still visually intact, but it had completely lost its power. She looked like a little girl playing dress-up in clothes way too big for her. The permanent scar Rosa had promised her the night before was finally bleeding through. It wasn't a physical cut. It was the horrific, inescapable moment when the sociopathic mask gets violently ripped off in public, when the entire room simultaneously realizes that you are an absolute monster, and the massive, unbridgeable gap between the lies you told and the garbage you actually are becomes totally undeniable. Rosa calmly reached up and pulled off the cheap reading glasses she'd worn all morning. Not with the dramatic flair of a movie reveal, but with the simple, exhausted motion of a professional clocking out after a brutal shift. Without the thick lenses hiding them, her eyes were finally fully exposed. Razor-sharp, hyper-vigilant, radiating that terrifying, apex-level intelligence that doesn't need to scream to prove it's the smartest thing in the room. One of the investors completely pushed his chair back and stood up, and the entire room, finally, collectively realized exactly who they had been messing with. What went down next happened in a terrifying kind of slow motion. Slow enough for the shockwaves to hit everyone in the chest, but way too fast for anyone to actually stop the bleeding. Victor Andrade locked his hands onto the armrests of his wheelchair, and he pushed himself up. He didn't stumble. He didn't shake with the pathetic weakness of a guy learning to walk again. He stood up with the brutal, ironclad stability of a man who had been perfectly capable of walking this entire time, and had simply decided the charade was officially over. He was a massive, imposing guy, and without the dark glasses, his eyes burned with that lethal, dead quiet intensity of a sniper who has spent 6 months staring through a scope without blinking. He locked eyes with Isabella, and the look on his face was the coldest, most absolute execution order anyone in that room had ever witnessed. It wasn't a screaming rage. It was the terrifying, sub-zero disgust of a man who threw out bait hoping the rat wouldn't take it, only to watch her swallow the hook whole. He just stood there in the dead silence, letting the visual detonate in their brains. The cripple who had been trapped in a chair for half a year, standing tall, dead-eyeing the parasite who thought she had successfully buried him, realizing she was the one locked in the coffin. Isabella's mouth fell open, she choked on air. Her face rapidly cycled through a total system failure. Wild shock, frantic calculation, aggressive denial, all violently overridden by the sheer, suffocating panic of a narcissist realizing there is absolutely no PR spin that can save her from this bloodbath. Victor slowly turned his head to the billionaires. "Gentlemen." His voice was pure, uncut boardroom venom. No fluff, no hesitation, just the brutal efficiency of a shark who knows exactly how much a minute costs. "You have just been given a front-row seat to the true character of the woman I unfortunately planned to marry." He let the silence hang for a split second. "The merger moves forward on schedule, but my last will and testament was aggressively restructured this morning. She gets absolutely nothing." The silence that hijacked the room was the heavy, calculating silence of 4 apex predators simultaneously rewriting their risk assessment portfolios based on the massacre they just witnessed. Isabella lost her mind. She started rapid-firing excuses. She was totally misunderstood. It was the crushing stress of the merger. It was a massive panic attack. When that failed, She tried to play the victim. She was just trying to aggressively manage a hostile, insubordinate employee who was sabotaging the deal. Then, when the billionaires just stared at her like she was radioactive waste, she went full scorched earth, screaming that she was being framed, that Victor had orchestrated a psychotic trap, that this was an legal abusive setup. Victor cut her off with 3 words. "We have tape." He didn't scream it. He dropped it with the terrifying calm of a drone pilot confirming a direct hit. The estate was wired. Hidden cameras, parabolic mics, encrypted DVR logs. Every single second of her reign of terror was sitting on a hard drive. The study assault last night, the screaming matches in the kitchen, the toxic threats in the hallways, the sickening conversation she had on her burner phone, arrogantly assuming the disabled billionaire couldn't hear her plotting his funeral. The sickening crack of her hand hitting Rosa's wrist was crystal clear on the high-def audio feeds. Her psychotic threats about framing Rosa for theft were logged and time-stamped. His bulldog attorney had been sitting on the entire encrypted file since 6 a.m. Her platinum trust fund was frozen. Her high society family was currently being briefed by his lawyers. And there was a private security extraction team waiting for her in the main foyer. Isabella bolted from the study the exact same way she lived her life, screaming, thrashing, desperately trying to use sheer volume to fake power. And she vanished through the oak doors, leaving behind nothing but the pathetic echo of a bully who just realized she was totally irrelevant. The study flatlined. One of the billionaires slowly turned to look at the guy next to him. They exchanged that specific silent nod of guys who have survived enough corporate bloodbaths to know exactly when to shut up and back away. The oldest shark in the room slowly stood up, shot his cuffs, and quietly announced they would wait in the grand salon while the boss handled his internal affairs. It was the raw, unadulterated respect of apex predators recognizing that the king needed to handle family business. They filed out, and Victor Andrade was left standing in the wreckage of his own study, the multi-million-dollar vault hanging wide open, standing face-to-face with Rosa. And then he did something he had probably never done in front of another human being in his entire ruthless career. He bowed his head. Not a polite corporate nod. It was a deep, heavy, total submission. The raw, undeniable physical admission of a man acknowledging a massive, life-altering debt that all his billions could never actually pay back. "I owe you a profound apology." His voice was completely stripped of the billionaire armor. It was just a guy talking to a ghost who had saved his life. "I thought I was running a stress test on the parasites, but you were the one testing me." Rosa just stared at him for a long, quiet minute, running that same terrifying, hyper-intelligent threat assessment she used on the safe. The look on her face was a brutal mix of validation and exhaustion. The look of a soldier who just realized the general actually saw her bleeding in the trenches and accepts the truce without demanding a medal. Victor laid it all out. He told her about the massive new division his firm was secretly spinning up, enterprise security architecture, specializing in ultra-high-end military-grade residential and corporate automation, a sector that was exploding faster than anyone could hire talent for. He admitted he had aggressively headhunted for the director chair 3 times in 2 years and struck out every time. He told her that watching her surgically dissect that vault in 2 minutes flat made him realize the absolute apex predator of the entire industry had been living in his basement for 12 years, polishing his silver and ironing his shirts. He offered her the throne, chief technology officer of the new division. He told her, with a dead serious intensity that proved this wasn't some pathetic pity hire, that her bare hands had literally written the foundational code for half the industry. That it was way past time she stopped cleaning the castle and started running the kingdom. Rosa stood dead silent. It wasn't the hesitation of fear. It was the massive, silent lag of a human brain trying to process a miracle, desperately running diagnostics to make sure it wasn't a trap before hitting accept. She slowly slid her hand into the deep pocket of her apron. Her fingers brushed against the photograph she had carried on every single brutal shift for a decade. Her daughter, frozen in time, flashing that brilliant, naive smile. She didn't pull the picture out. She just pressed her thumb against it for 1 second, a desperate silent prayer to the ghost that kept her alive. Then she looked up at Victor, and the smile that broke across her face fundamentally altered the gravity in the room. It wasn't the tiny, broken, exhausted smile from the patio. It was the massive, radiant, absolute powerhouse of a grin she had kept locked in a box for 12 years. The real, unfiltered smile of a genius who finally got the green light to go to war. Only if I get total remote work clearance on Wednesdays. Her voice was suddenly bleeding with a warmth that hadn't existed in this story until right now. I have a garden that needs my attention. Victor threw his head back and laughed. It was a massive, booming, genuine roar. The explosive, hysterical relief of a guy who had been holding his breath in a sniper hide for 6 months, who just realized he survived the war, and the absolute best soldier on the battlefield was on his team. Out in the hallway, one of the billionaire sharks was leaning against the mahogany wall, listening to the laughter echo. He smiled a tight, predatory grin, realizing the merger he was about to sign was going to be infinitely more terrifying and infinitely more profitable than he had ever dreamed. The next 6 months were a masterclass in the universe, violently correcting the timeline. Rosa incinerated the gray apron. She stepped into the boardroom wearing sharp, custom-tailored blazers, the armor she had buried in a closet when the tech industry told her she was obsolete. Her tiny desk in the servants' quarters was replaced by a massive glass corner office with 4 4K monitors, and the terrified junior developers who walked in to pitch her treated her like a god. Not because she screamed at them, but because she possessed a terrifying, godlike level of code mastery, and she had the ruthless generosity to actually train them instead of using her genius as a weapon to crush them. The legend Victor strategically leaked to the press, heavily redacted to protect the innocent, but dripping with the core truth of a master hacker who spent a decade hiding as a maid before cracking a military vault with a screwdriver to save a billionaire, went viral with the terrifying speed of a myth that is just too badass to ignore. The new division stock didn't just climb, it violently exploded, leaving Wall Street analysts desperately trying to figure out what the hell just happened. Isabella was ejected from the estate screaming that she was going to burn his empire to the ground, only to discover that when you have zero leverage, nobody can hear you scream. Her name didn't get officially blacklisted, it just became radioactive in the exact VIP circles she desperately needed to survive in. Old money doesn't do loud, dramatic lawsuits. They do quiet executions. 3 massive trust fund contracts associated with her family mysteriously evaporated within 6 months, blamed on shifting market synergies. The classic corporate code for "we know exactly what you did, and you are dead to us." There were no screaming matches, no dramatic court battles. She just ceased to exist. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, Rosa Alencar's backyard garden was dead silent, the heavy, productive silence of dark soil and deep roots. She had just finalized the charter for a massive new nonprofit, entirely funded by her signing bonus, dedicated to aggressive, elite-level coding boot camps for underprivileged girls. The waitlist had blown up so fast it crashed the servers on day 1. The exact kind of catastrophic failure Rosa considered the absolute best problem on Earth to solve. She knelt down in the dirt next to a sapling she had planted a week ago, pressing her bare fingers deep into the soil with the exact same hyper-focused, tactile intensity she had used to crack the biometric vault. She felt the roots holding strong. She smiled. Now I'm asking you, if you were in Rosa's shoes, after 12 grueling years of scrubbing floors in silence, after getting slapped in the face, after being treated like absolute garbage, would you have taken Victor's massive job offer? Or was the fact that he used you as a pawn in his psychotic stress test too toxic to ever forgive? Drop your verdict in the comments. I genuinely want to know if you would have taken the money or walked away. Because this brutal story proves that your actual, undeniable value has absolutely nothing to do with the cheap title on your badge or the uniform they force you to wear. It's built entirely on the lethal skills you secretly forge in the dark and the ironclad dignity you refuse to surrender when the world treats you like a ghost. The invisible people in the room always see the kill shot before the arrogant loudest guy even realizes he's in a fight. And the only respect that actually survives the bloodbath is the respect you violently take for yourself. If you believe that real, raw talent deserves absolute respect, and you love stories that hit like a freight train, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell to join the crew. The next story is already locked and loaded.